Good morning. Today I am speaking at the Peace Community Church on Jesus meeting us in the struggle. So, join along and let me know what you think.
Pray that you bless Richie, you bless his thoughts and his words that have been on his heart, and that he would be speaking through your mouth, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good morning. So, a lot of times I find when I get up and speak, a lot of the time I feel like I'm speaking more to me than to anyone else. This is no different. My message that I want to share today is titled, Jesus Spared Them in the Struggles. We've seen it a lot. As we were just discussing, there's a lot of struggles going on in our world right now, whether it's locally or internationally. It's everywhere, and that has always been. We know God can take any of these struggles away at the snap of a finger because he has that control and that power. But it doesn't have the same effect. And we'll start with reading in Daniel 6. I'm going to read the whole chapter, so bear with me. But I think it just really, it all ties together, and it's hard to pull it apart. I'm reading in the new NASB, New American Standard. It seemed to be good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one of them, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then Daniel began distinguishing himself amongst the commissioners and the satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground or accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find a ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Then these satraps and commissioners came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. "King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or any man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document, and that is the injunction. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open towards Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. "Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes petition to any other god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den?" Then the king replied, "The statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked." Then they answered and spoke before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day." Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. And these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king established may be changed." Then the king gave the orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." So here we have a king who personally doesn't have any form of relationship with God, but he has seen the relationship that Daniel has with God. And he has faith that if there's any way that Daniel will survive this encounter, that's it. Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of the nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, with no entertainment brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn, and at the break of day went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king. I have committed no crime." Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought the men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that all dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, the enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we have this, that there's so much there to unpack in that chapter. But we have Daniel. He was faithful to God in his work, and because of that, he was successful in his work. That made his colleagues around him jealous. And they knew there was no way that they could accuse him or condemn him in his abilities, in his job. So they went to God and they went after Darius's pride. By doing that, by making it illegal to pray to any other god, that is where they felt that they had him. The trap worked, and Darius knew that he had been tricked, but he also knew that if he didn't follow through, it would be the end of his reign. We read about his lack of sleep, how he rushed to the den first thing in the morning. Like I said, you could see he truly believed. Even though he wasn't a Christian, he didn't believe in God. But you could see that he felt that there was something there. He knew that the only way Daniel would survive was through God. So let's look at this from Daniel's perspective. He's trapped for his faith, and he's thrown to the lions. Now, we know that God could have struck down the guards. He could have struck down the lions. He could have had Daniel fight and defeat the lions. But that wasn't going to have the same effect. For them to get there in the morning and all of these lions still be perfectly fine and Daniel to be perfectly fine, there's no other answer other than that divine intervention, that God was in this, and what a testimony. And then when they did remove Daniel and the others that had trapped Daniel were thrown in, they were killed instantly. The lions were after them. There's no question that there was this overwhelming protection of God involved. We'll read another chapter, this time chapter 3. And now we're going back to Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of God, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps and prefects and governors and counselors and treasurers and judges, the magistrates and the rulers of the provinces, to come in to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then Herod loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nation, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans, I think I said that right, came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man that hears the different musics should fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of the furnace, the blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not worship the golden image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring the men forward, and these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace. He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image." Outright stating, don't care. This is not right. We will serve God and God alone. If it is our demise, so be it, but we have faith that he can save us. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it usually heated. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up, their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men fell into the midst of the furnace of the blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king, astounded, and stood up in haste, and he said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men that we cast and bound into the middle of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loose and walking about in the midst of the fire, without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of the blazing fire, and he responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came back out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies. Nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor their trousers damaged. They didn't even have the smell of fire come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielding up their bodies as so not to serve or worship any other gods. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speak anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be torn limb from limb and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. So, on one hand, you had Darius, who hoped for Daniel that his God would be able to save him. On the other hand, we had Nebuchadnezzar, who was determined that there was no way. It's the same situation throughout the Bible over and over again, where God could have prevented it from ever escalating to that situation. But if God had changed it in any other way, would it have that effect, that far-reaching effect, that Nebuchadnezzar would completely transform, that he would actually threaten, not that that's the right way to do it any more so than the other, but that now he's threatening anyone who speaks against God? There are so many times that we see that. Moses parting the Red Sea for the Israelites that they could pass through. He could have just dried out the sea. But if he had dried out the sea, that chase would have continued. By parting the sea and having it collapse back in on the Egyptians as they're chasing them, that chase was over. And unfortunately, like so much in our own worlds, we see these miraculous signs. We know that God is behind this. Do we stay the course? Do we continue to stay the course? Moses and the Israelites were several times throughout their story where they would come to God and then they would fail and fall back, and there would be a delay in reaching the promised land, and they would come to God and back. Where do we fall in? It's not just the Old Testament either. As we get into the New Testament, in Mark, and Jesus heals the blind man by his faith. Or the woman with the constant bleeding in Matthew, who knows that if she can even touch his clothes, and their faith heals them. Or the paralyzed man whose friends lower him through the roof to get him close. This man walked out of a room that he went into paralyzed, that his friends had to drop him through the roof. And he walked out of this room carrying the pallet they lowered him on. Our faith is ultimately where we need to be, and we need to be constantly searching for Jesus. We are going to have struggles. That is an absolute guarantee in our life. But when we truly keep our eyes on Jesus, he is just and he is good, and he has a far better plan, a far better outcome planned than we could ever imagine. And not just for us, but for those around us. The people around us will constantly be watching us and seeing how we respond to troubling times. I think about Pastor Anand right now in India, and he has this debt, and he's been able to meet these needs. And he has this other debt, and I agree that with prayer and faith, and that when that debt gets taken away, the people around him, around that orphanage, will know that there is a higher power behind this. But God doesn't spare us from struggles. That has never been his thing. I have never seen it in my stories that I've read. It's always he meets you in that struggle and he brings you out of that struggle. And that is what I think we need to remember today. My encouragement today is to smile in that struggle, is to praise God in the midst of that challenging time, and to continue to pray God's direction, mercy, and plan on our lives. Because I think that if we truly praise in that struggle, and then we can watch God work around us. And that is something that is far beyond my comprehension. On that note, I will wrap up there.
So thank you for joining us as we dig in today and we see where Jesus meets us. I pray that this would have touched you and that you enjoyed what you had to hear. You're always more than welcome to join us in person if you are local to Taylor. And I pray that you have a wonderful day. Take care.